This episode is brought to you in part by Inato. Inato's entirely free platform is empowering community-based research sites all around the globe with access and unheard of levels of visibility to the right top clinical research trials. You can see open or upcoming trials as far as 12 months in advance with tools and features to help you focus on trials that are the best fit for you and your patients. Look, I can tell you from experience, being able to easily select trials and focus on the right ones is a whole lot better than wasting time and energy applying to just anything and everything. It's becoming more and more important for sites to ensure that they're choosing trials that are great fits for them. Inato's advocates help you showcase for sponsors your diverse patient populations, community engagement efforts, diverse staff, and really all the things that help make your site unique. It only takes 2 minutes, so head on over and sign up today. That's inato.com, INATO.com. This episode is also brought to you by Veeva. Veeva connects patients, sites, and sponsors on a single technology ecosystem to help make clinical trials easier and faster. Look, if you haven't been paying attention, we are super excited to be using SiteVault. It's made the startup process so much easier to get our documents electronically signed rather than shuffle paperwork around, try to flag down doctors and get them to sign your big stack of papers. SiteVault gives research sites one place to work with sponsors, reduces the number of systems and logins used to run clinical trials. There are already more than 4,500 sites using SiteVault, and there are more than 400 industry sponsors using Veeva clinical applications. That's a lot of sites and a lot of sponsors. The best part is that SiteVault is completely free to use. Not many products can say that nowadays. So to learn more, head on over to sites.veeva.com. That is sites.veeva.com. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Our guest this week is Ignacio Handal. Ignacio is the CEO at Clinicom Healthcare. He's completed hundreds of FDA clinical trials across all phases and has over 2 decades of experience. In 2022, Ignacio was honored with one of the highest honors in clinical research, the Christine Pierre Clinical Trials Lifetime Achievement Award, of which only 8 clinical researchers globally have ever been awarded. Ignacio and his team have used 100% of their profits from the research trials over the last 20 years to develop the world's first online mental health assessment software that can assess anyone remotely for over 81 mental health conditions. Clinicom has helped patients all over the world find answers on their mental health journey. Clinicom has also helped accelerate enrollment and patient identification for precise inclusion and exclusion criteria in 70 phase 2 and 3 studies in the U.S. Their mission is to give every patient a voice and bring equity and access to mental health. Clinicom currently serves patients on 6 continents. Look, I'm a real big fan of Ignacio. Unfortunately, our interview got cut a little bit short due to some technical difficulties I was having. So if you have the opportunity, go to notetofilepodcast.com. Check out the live stream that Ignacio did in which he demoed Clinicom. It's a really impressive system, and I feel like an audio interview doesn't really do justice to what Clinicom is putting together. So make sure you head on over and check out that live stream. This week, we discuss how to improve site selection, the challenges of vendor selection, and how Clinicom was born from a site. So without further ado, Ignacio Handal. All right, this week we welcome Ignacio Handal. Ignacio, how's it going, man?
Hey, Brad, how are you doing today?
Rocking and rolling like always. Where are you coming to us from?
I'm in southern Alabama, right by the Panhandle of Florida.
Yeah, so it's always nice. I rarely talk to people who are in the same time zone as me. I know that seems like insignificant, but central time zone, it's just nice to have somebody on the same page.
Yeah, I think the central time zone, we're the most confused, right? We're working Eastern people and the Pacific, so it's always trying to adjust time.
Yeah, no, it is a lot of, simple addition and subtraction. But yeah, I feel like I'm never talking to someone in the central time zone, so I'm always having to think twice. Anyways, I just want to jump in, same way I do with, all of our guests. I always find it real interesting to hear people's backgrounds in terms specifically about clinical trials. So, tell us about your origin story, what brought you into the clinical trial space, and kind of, catch us up to what you're doing today.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I've been doing clinical research for nearly 20 years. Started in 2003. We launched a CNS research site here in Alabama that is now, we're told, is the 3rd leading private CNS research site in the country. We've probably touched 90% of the CNS drugs that have been released to market through phase 2 or phase 3 studies in the last 20 years. 100 plus studies, dozens and dozens of drugs and devices to market. We went on to create a research site at the third largest surgical center in the country, Eye Center South, Surgical Center South. And then after that, I was tapped by a CRO to be a director and lead designing studies, selling studies, and executing studies globally across multiple, countries and organizations. And really, using the site experience that I had, I was expecting to go into the CROs and thinking that they knew everything. And I actually had the opposite experience of like realizing what they didn't know and how things really worked. So it was a really eye-opening experience for me. And since then, our site, our CNS site, in the process of doing studies, we really needed a tool to triage patients for mental health, to screen them, to assess them. So we do own clinics and TMS centers, and we also own our research site. And we realized very quickly that, we're measuring low and slow for CNS sites. And then on our clinical side, there wasn't a lot of tools available to assess people other than some paper instruments for triaging a baseline for mental health and tracking metric-based care. So we spent the last 20 years and a lot of our profits from our clinical research studies developing a tool called Clinicom. And since, we've just recently in the last 2 or 3 years commercialized that product widely. And now, there's at least a Clinicom site in every continent now on the planet. But we basically, Clinicom can assess anybody anywhere remotely for most of the conditions in the diagnostic manual for psychiatry. Basically send somebody a link. They go through an augmented intelligence. So it's not a survey. It's an adaptive intelligence that asks the right questions to the right patients to screen you for about 80 conditions to the standard of the diagnostic manual for psychiatry.
Nice. That's really interesting. And, at first, I'll drill down a little bit because, like I say, I always tell people there's always a soft spot for anyone who started working on sort of the site level and having to sort of go through that struggle and see what it's like, and then to make the jump to CRO. I guess, how did you, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but how did you find that transition? A lot of people at the site level want to go to the CRO side, and it's a pretty popular topic. I see site level folks talking about.
It's a hard jump to make.
Yeah.
A lot of people, struggle with making that jump. A lot of CROs want to hire CRAs that, started as nurses, then they go to CRAs, and then they don't really have that site experience. And so it was a challenging jump to make, but then it was also very eye-opening to, what CROs really do. I've worked with 50, 60 different CROs over 2 decades, and they all have, their idiosyncrasies and their ways and methods. But I think the experience of having worked with so many and seeing what vendors they use, what processes they have, being able to compare and contrast that and bringing that to a global CRO and adding flavor to saying, hey, I've seen 2 other people try that didn't work. I've seen other people try that, maybe, whatever experience we had from that. But once I was in there, it was eye-opening to see the process and realizing that CROs really are project management companies to administer regulatory, safety, data gathering. But on the clinical execution side, the sites are really the experts. The sites understand the therapeutic areas, they understand how to measure, what to measure, and the detailed process of that. I know the CROs have to manage the data and the output and the regulatory side of all that. But I still strongly believe that even after my CRO experience, that the sites really run the show. They do all the work. The CROs are just gathering the data and, compiling it and making sure things are done safely and that the safety alerts are done and that everything's done to the regulatory requirements. But the sites are truly the experts and the people that understand how to bring drugs to market and do the heavy lift. Every day I gain more and more respect for CRCs and PIs and sub-Is because, to me, the coordinators, I started as a coordinator. I get it. They do most of the work for clinical trials, and I don't think they get enough credit. People always say, oh, the PI this, the PI that. But the truth is the PI gathers some data, but 80% of that lift of the site is going to happen from the CRC.
Yeah. I think it's pretty, at least again, if you've worked at a site level, pretty well acknowledged. Like, obviously we need PIs, we need their expertise, we need their oversight, play a big role in patient safety. But frankly, a lot of them don't understand all the other nuance and sort of ins and outs and, day-to-day challenges that the CRCs are having to do. I mean, think about how practices run, they've got nurses and MAs and schedulers taking care of all that stuff. Well, a lot of times that's one person on research, and it's the CRC managing all of that. So, including regulatory and maybe even budgets and contracts, depending on how you're structured. So
imagine a doctor's office with no nurses, right? That's what it would be like without, with no support staff, no scheduling people, no admin people, no finance people, and no nurses. And the doctor's just trying to do it all themselves. It just wouldn't run.
Right.
And so that's the analogy I give for the CRC does all that typically, right? Even sometimes down to collecting money.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. Yeah. Do you think that, sites aren't appropriately leveraging their expertise? It still feels very much like they're sort of at the bottom of the totem pole in a lot of the interactions, whether they be, financial or otherwise.
I feel like groups like Society for Clinical Research Sites, for the last decade or so have been trying to augment the voice. Sean over there and Marcus have been doing a great job of, and the team really over there have been doing a great job of augmenting the voice within the sites to the sites. But I think we haven't done enough of a job of augmenting the voice of the sites to CROs and sponsors to give them more of a voice. So typically, if there's an issue or a suggestion or an idea, a site has that their only voice to that megaphone is to their CRA. Right. And then the CRA may or may not make a comment to their director. And then, it may or may not get put in. And I think there should be more of a line for important things above the communication line from just the CRA or just to the project manager. A lot of people don't realize, when I was at the sites, I thought the project manager runs the whole show. Right. And in reality, the project manager is executing the plan that the director and the executives at CRO are telling them to do, and they stay within that box. Right. They don't have a framework to work outside of that box or think outside of that box. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and follow the sequence. And so, if you're looking to execute change and add suggestions to your CRO from a site level, I always suggest reaching out to the program director, project director, clinical director at the CRO that's overseeing that project manager, because those are the people that can make a difference, not necessarily your CRA or your project manager. And I think that's an important thing that I didn't know when I was at the sites. We still own our sites and still operate them. And the other thing I think I would comment on is that, we have expanded our sites and tried to build a network of sites, kind of a mini SMO, and trying to bring therapeutic treatment options to doctors that are interested in doing research. And we've done that on several occasions and bringing, new PIs in. And I think the key linchpin and doctors are trying to get in this space. Maybe they've been a PI in residency. Maybe they've been a sub-I, but without a good CRC, it's a no-go, right? Like the CRC makes it or breaks it for anybody entering the space. And I know in doing site selection as a director, when the project manager gives me the sites and the lists and the CVs and we go yes or no, typically, and to give that approval, the big question is, okay, what's the experience of the PI? What's the bandwidth right now for the PI? And then the next question is, how good is their coordinator, right? How many studies have they done? Somebody who's coordinated 1 or 2 studies, every study is different, as you know, right? You have to flex and you have to learn and you have to do things differently. But, once you've passed the 10 study mark, most CRCs are pretty grounded and can get the next 20 studies, right? It can get it done. The problem is the data shows from global data that most PIs do 1 study and they don't ever do another study again.
Right.
I think it's like 60 or 70%. Don't quote me on this number, but it's a high percentage have done less than 10. Right. And out of the 390 something thousand PIs in the world, only 393, according to global data, have done more than 50 studies. So that's our problem. Right. So we got to get regular doctors involved in studies, and we have to start training and hiring more. Every nurse in the country should learn how to coordinate, and every nurse, you should have every decent sized practice should have a coordinator, and we should augment training and access to learning how to become a clinical research coordinator and the validation of that.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more to do. And interesting, I've had this conversation a lot recently. We, like you guys, we embed with private practices, and we also work with a large health system, and even trying to sort of replicate that across, some potential new clients and other health systems. And I think it's oftentimes just sort of seen as something people think you can just scale up real fast. And I think what you're pointing out is one of the big reasons why you can't. I mean, I think not just a good coordinator who has experience and technical ability, but a lot of it's about the fit and the match between the CRC and the clinics in which they work. Like, you can be a great CRC, but if you don't get along with your PI is not going to cooperate with you, or the clinic manager is not going to cooperate with you, or the nurses and MAs that you have to integrate and work with are not going to cooperate. And it can become a challenge. It can become contentious, which is going to, obviously make the PI be like, I don't want to deal with this. This is a bunch of extra work. Nobody's happy. And I think that takes time. It takes time to develop those relationships well. And that's where, as much as I sometimes hate to admit it, like maybe this is not the most easily scalable thing, right? It just takes time and it takes effort and it takes relationship building.
I think you're right, Brad. I think you're also hitting on a point that I think we've also faced the challenge of, you find a PI that's really interested in bringing new therapeutic options to patients. A lot of the doctors that we have worked with in the past are like, hey, I want this not because I just want to have extra revenue, but my patients have tried 4 or 5 different things. And for the guy who's tried everything and nothing in the current market's working, I want to be able to give another option. And that's why we did clinical research to start was, very challenging cases that we got, for child psychiatry and adolescent psychiatry that the current medicines weren't working. We wanted to give families another opportunity, another option. I think the biggest challenge in trying to expand a site to other PIs, and I know there's many sites after they've been in business for 3 to 5 years, they start thinking to themselves, well, there's all these other doctors in my community. How do I get them involved? How do I grow my site? How do I grow my footprint? And the best advice I can give, and having tried this in many different ways, is if you try to convince a very busy nurse to also be a very busy CRC, it's not going to work, right? And that's the person who's always going to give the negative feedback to the doctor going, this is too much. I can't do this, right? They slow the whole train down, right? As excited as the doctor may be for your study and enrolling, they can also slow you down on enrollment and, just say, hey, I just don't want to do this week. I'm not going to screen anybody. And so the way we've kind of solved that is, going to ACRP. And everybody, whether you're a member or not, you can go to the American Clinical Research Professionals Group. And there's a listing there of trained and certified coordinators looking for jobs, and you got to pay them well. You're not going to turn your MA into an excellent coordinator overnight. And so why try to recreate the wheel when there are existing people that you got to pay? You got to pay them decent, but you can hire them and bring them in and they can come in running. Right? They can come in running and do regulatory and do the things that you need them to do. And if you do that and provide that extra person so it's not on their main nurse, the PI all of a sudden gets really excited about research and really excited about the treatment options. And then hopefully tertiarily get excited about the revenue it could bring to them.
Yeah, well, and again, I think it's up to us to make it easy, quote unquote. We know it's not easy, but I think to make it as easy as it can be. Because again, a lot of these, especially private community-based physicians, they're maybe struggling, or not struggling, but, they're focused on keeping their practice up and running and, giving their patients the attention they deserve. And to your point, a lot of them want to participate in research, but, just don't have that infrastructure. I mean, there's more and more, companies maybe like what you're doing and like what we're doing, coming to market out there. I think it's becoming more prevalent, becoming more well-known. Probably, I don't know about you, but I came into this industry just completely by accident. I had no idea what I was getting into. And I became, research assistant at the local university. But now there are people out there coming in very intentionally. And I think we can utilize that, to your point, instead of trying to sort of split time, make it a mess, and take advantage of the people out there who are pursuing opportunities.
I don't think a lot of the private sites or people entering the private site space understand the real power that they have in gaining access to these therapeutic trials, in the sense that, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was the academic centers doing all this, right? And so the researchers it went a lot slower. Academics aren't making extra money if they have 10 studies or 3. So there's no hurry for them to enroll or get things done. So as the private site space grew in the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of CROs and pharma companies realize that, hey, these private sites can actually get this done quicker, get more of a focus on it. And so, when a study director at a CRO is looking at the site selection, one of my main rules was always like, don't ever give more than 20 or 30% of the sites to the SMOs. They'll always overpromise you and tell you that they're going to get you 100 patients and they'll get you 3, right? Don't overweigh, getting the guy from Harvard and Yale and getting those big brand names in. They're going to cost you 3 times as much. They're going to be a lot slower and the output's less, right? So I always try to get at least like a 50, 60% focus on private sites because, with experience. And I think one of the things that, as a former, one of the things we did to improve site selection. So let me back up a little bit. I think everybody, or maybe they don't know, the biggest challenges in the cost of slowing down a study are, one, a poorly written protocol with poor inclusion exclusion that needs amendments. That always costs money and time. That slows everything down. And then poor site selection, right? Selecting a third of the sites that a CRO or pharma will pick for a study will not produce a single patient. So there's all that time wasted in launching them, setting them up, training them, and nothing happens, right? So our system was broken for many years based on site feasibility questionnaires, right? You get a survey at a site, you fill it out, you say what you can and can't do, how many patients you might be able to fit. And for many years, that's all CROs had to go on making an assessment other than your CV and some of the history you might have or previous history working with them. So if you didn't have any previous history, it was hard to see. But now there's, amazing tools like Sightline, and I know that was a big thing I pushed for the CRO I was at. Guys, we got to use Sightline. It's like the Bloomberg terminal of clinical research, that in globaldata.com to see, okay, I like Sightline better than Global Data. Has more data. You can actually see like the bandwidth of a PI. So instead of using an SFQ, you can literally say, okay, look at Brad's site. How many studies he's currently doing, not by his opinion, but like what the data shows. How many studies are you registered with? What is your bandwidth, right? How much experience do you have in this therapeutic area? What competing studies do you really have? And that tool is kind of democratized site selection in my view, and that every single study in any CRO or sponsor, small pharma or otherwise, should make the investment to get into that. Because to me, that's a game changer, right? If I can look at a site and go, hey, the number one expert in the world, who everybody wants to do the study, has 30 studies for this, and he's also a clinician. And the number 2 guy in the world has got 2 studies for this. Who do you really want to hire, right?
Right.
Or maybe the number 5 guy, he's got 10 studies for this he's done before, and he's got no studies for this particular TA right now. I really need him, right, over that number 1 guy. And so I really think it's democratizing that site selection process. People do not realize that every day lost in a study costs between $800,000 and up to $3 million in lost revenue for pharma per day of lost sale of product, right? So every day you're not enrolling, every day you're late to deliver, it's a tremendous amount of money lost. So just picking better sites, and in my opinion, private sites, changes the game. It moves the needle big,
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. And you actually, take advantage of the data available instead of sort of autopiloting that process. And then, I mean, let's go beyond that, now, and we talked about it a little bit before we started taping, but decentralized and, going beyond your traditional, sites, whether they be private or academic or whatever the case may be. I mean, or how big is the value proposition there? I think you and I, maybe we share the sentiment that maybe not as much as initially thought, but I mean, how much does that add to the mix here?
I think it's tremendous. I think it has a tremendous value, but not on a standalone basis. So not all studies, in my opinion, have the potential to be completely decentralized or completely remote. What everybody talks about decentralized is really a hybrid approach, right? So some inpatient in-site visits and some remote visits via telemedicine or some remote gathering tools like Clinicom. Like that's what we do as well for life sciences, gathering CNS data remotely. But I think there's a misconception that, any company that has access to patients can all of a sudden, launch a decentralized clinical trial company. And I call it Silicon Valley vaporware, right? A bunch of people that all of a sudden think I can get some money together and enter this space, they don't understand the space, never worked in the space, and don't have the relationships to even sell in the space. Because this is a trust industry, right? You don't just get 30 studies when you start. You get one, right? And you build up trust over time. And if you break that trust one time, you're done, right? So if you've been in this business for 20 years, it's because you're doing something right and honestly and with standards. And so I think, the best tools I've seen emerge have been tools that have literally emerged out of sites, right? I mean, look at real-time CTMS, Rick over there, right? I mean, his family owns one of the biggest sites in Texas, right? Look at Florence Healthcare, Ryan Jones and that team, they really understood the process. So I think pharma companies and people investing in this space should really look at, what is their true knowledge of the space, not just, hey, Tom, Dick, and Harry worked at so-and-so pharmaceutical company for 5 years. That doesn't mean anything about clinical trial knowledge. On the execution and operation side, that means almost nothing. It's really important to compare apples with apples, and also to understand the difference between, somebody with deep relationships and experience versus an idea with money behind it.
Yeah. And I think it's validating to hear somebody else say that, because I feel that a lot. And I see these things and I'm like, okay, these conversations are being had, but not by someone who's actually like done it or been down in it. And not that good ideas can't come from anywhere. They obviously can, and they should. And I do appreciate outsider perspective, but I can't tell you how many phone calls I take with people who have an idea or whatever the case may be, and it becomes real apparent they don't understand some of the most basic issues that are going to prevent that from even being able to be done. So, maybe it's a mix, like maybe it's more collaboration between the sort of people down in the trenches, like your real time. I mean, real time's a great example. I use them. I love those guys. Like, you can tell in the product they built, it came from years of experience dealing with it. And you don't see that with a lot of the other stuff. Again, I mean, the vaporware analogy is not too far off for a lot of these things that we're seeing. And I think that's, for me, I mean, that's scary. I don't like that, right? Because we're down here seeing patients every day. We want things to be better. We want to contribute, but that doesn't get the attention, or necessarily it's not as sexy and exciting as some of these other things that are sort of destined, I think, to fail, but are getting so much more attention.
I'd like to also comment on how a CRO makes a vendor selection. So the vendor selection process is pretty cumbersome. They have to get the pharma company's approval. They have to have a budget for it. So there's not an infinite amount of money. So when you have a budget and you're sold a study, that's the package you sold. You might be able to add one thing to it, make a change order, but when it's in motion, it's in motion. So trying to sell to somebody who's got an actively enrolling study is not going to happen, right? So there's a time delay. And then also, you can't just keep adding vendors to a study. So there's been studies on how the impact of these decentralized trial vendors have had on the cost and time to execution of clinical trials. And the fact is, it's making studies take longer and cost more, right? Because you're stacking vendor upon vendor, and then all of a sudden the complexity increases and things just take a little longer anytime you add more Lego pieces. So, if we're trying to make studies go faster, you need platforms, not point solutions. Right? You need things that are like real time, that do 10 different things, not just one. So if you're out there investing or putting money into or thinking of a good idea and it's a point solution, I would say that, it's going to be pretty challenging for you. I would also comment that it's really an issue of, convincing a pharma company of, hey, you need to use this. And that is like moving a mountain. That does not happen overnight. And if you don't have the cash flow or the investment to see that through, you're going to have trouble, right? I mean, it's not, you don't convince the Pfizer of the world to go buy a vendor or something overnight, right? That doesn't happen. So there's a lot to be said about what that needs to look like or what that could be. So,
yeah, I mean, Pfizer is still using shared investigator platform, unfortunately. So we certainly know it's not a quick and easy thing to get away from.
Yeah.
Well, fairness, I wanted to hear a little bit more about Clinicom. Is that being utilized as sort of is using that in clinical trials? Is it being used in trials to collect, data?
Yeah, I mean, we've used it to, one of the hardest things in CNS trials is getting a good baseline, right? Getting a good understanding of the comorbidity somebody has or does not have. And typically the old school way of that being done is the PI sitting down with the patient and checking some boxes. Patient's not schizophrenic. Patient's not this. And it's like an opinion sometimes based on a bunch of questions and a lot of digging in. And sometimes it's literally a doctor just going, check, right? And so that's not a really good way to assess somebody.
Right.
And so, the example I give is, if you have a depression study and all of a sudden you have 4 or 5 bipolar patients that present depressed that end up in your study, your data is gone. Like you skew an entire study because those patients will not respond to SSRIs or other things, right? That actually will make them worse and more manic. So you can destroy an entire drug, not because the drug doesn't work, but because you put the wrong people in. And so our goal at Clinicom, we've used Clinicom to screen our patients at our sites for over 70 studies as a pre-screening tool to triage the patients. We can also look at assessing an inclusion-exclusion criteria. So we load the complete inclusion-exclusion. So one of the things, I don't want to name a recruitment company, but I'm frustrated with recruitment companies that send you a list of 100 patients and say, oh, I got you a bunch of patients. And you call 97 of them and only 3 of them fit, right? Think of all the time wasted from your CRC and your management staff just trying to dig those out, or using crystal reports or something to look through an EMR data to find people that, you can get half of the inclusion exclusion figured out, but the other half you got to still dig. So what we wanted to do was create something where I load the entire detailed inclusion exclusion, and this tool can literally remotely screen 1,000 people remotely and triage the list and tell me, these 10 actually make full inclusion exclusion, not part of it, but the entire thing. These don't, using the same standardized instruments built in that we use for clinical trials, but done remotely. And then it also kind of can show what inclusion exclusions are failing. So maybe you can do protocol adjustments before you launch your study. You can use it as a pre-site selection tool to say, hey, Brad, you got a new depression study. I'm going to send you this tool, send it to your, you put on your SFQ, you got 50 patients for this. Email them these 50 people this thing, and let's see how many of them actually qualify. Right. So you can actually do deeper dive site selection and actually see if it's real or not. And that's something Sightline can do for you. Right. And then also, we can also build the visit schedule into the platform and connect that to an EDC. So basically, any of the assessments you need to do either in person or virtually can be gathered virtually or entered in directly through the portal by the clinician. And then that just pumps into the EDC. So
that's beautiful.
We've been mainly focused on selling to clinicians, right? We sell mainly to clinicians, ERs, primary care, therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists, but we are, I guess, entering the life science space, even though we've been in the life science space for 20 years as far as selling the product commercially there. And that's kind of a newer thing in the last year for us because we really spent, like I said, almost 20 years refining the tool before we even try to sell it. And the only reason we were able to do that is because of the lucrative clinical trial site that we own and using the profits of that to fund this. Because, that has been, instead of going out and spending those millions on Ferraris, we put it back into bringing equity and access to mental health. And so, I'm passionate about it. And also, aside from life sciences, one of the most cool things I think we can do is, if you said, hey, triage an entire school, 1,000 kids, do it in 24 hours, you can literally pick out who's aggressive, who's suicidal, give me the entire list of the Veterans Administration. I can triage that whole list and tell you, okay, these are the suicidal vets that need to be seen today. These are the guys with TBI, and really kind of meet people in the middle where people don't realize that a psychiatrist there's 60% of counties in the country have no psychiatrists. Psychiatrists are more rare than librarians. You're more likely to run into a librarian than you are a psychiatrist.
That's crazy.
And so there's a lot of, there's 800,000 counselors out in the country, and they do a lot of the lift. But they need help. They don't know how to differentiate sometimes between Asperger's and autism and schizophrenia and the different variants. And so Clinicom's kind of like the guardrails, not necessarily a diagnostic tool, but a clinical decision support tool to say, hey, I can take care of this guy myself, or maybe they need to go to a higher level of care.
Yeah. And I love that. Obviously still an incredibly unmet need at this point, right?
Yeah.
Well, very good. Ignacio, where can people find you online? Where can they learn more about Clinicom?
Yeah. So, they can just go to clinicom.com and check us out. Though we offer a free trial for any clinician trying to use it, if it's a research side or a private practice or primary care, even pediatricians. Anybody can go register for free and use it for free for 30 days. And one of the big things, and people think I'm a little crazy when I say this, but one of the main things we wanted to accomplish was equity and access. So that also means, a really low price point. So it's only $12 per patient. And that's an initial global assessment with unlimited follow-ups for a year. So you can track and measure somebody every week, every day, or every month, unlimited for an entire year for a simple $12. And the reason we did that was, we also wanted, other countries and some third world countries and other places that need affordable access to care and affordable triaging of mental health to be able to afford this. And we've been wildly successful now. Like I said, we're in 6 continents and growing every day. And just every day I'm seeing more and more clinicians from all around the world sign up. It's been a really exciting and a 20-year labor of love from also our chairman and my father, who's a distinguished fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, really laboring over this beast for many years. I mean, it was a challenge to take the entire manual for psychiatry, lay out questions that align to each criteria, and then build adaptive augmented intelligence algorithms that triage you through that. So that was not an easy lift. I mean, most medical device companies that create something for one condition or two might take 5 or 10 years.
Right.
We are now able to screen 80 conditions. So it took a while, and we're glad that now it's out to market and helping lots of people everywhere.
Yeah, that's crazy. If you're open to it, come on the live stream sometime. Maybe demo if you're willing and able. Not put you on the spot, but
I'd love to.
I really like to use that sort of more visual medium to do those sorts of things. But otherwise, anything else before we sort of wrap up here?
No, Brad, I appreciate. I just want to thank you, Brad, and thank you for the work you're doing to bring awareness to the challenges that sites face. I love your commentary on LinkedIn and some of the things that you do to kind of bring a softer touch and a more humanistic touch to the realities that sites face. And I hope that a lot of pharma and CROs are paying attention and taking notes. So thank you for what you do.
Well, we'll see. We'll see if they are for better or worse. But either way, yeah, I'm going to keep doing it. And, I appreciate you being part of that ecosystem. I mean, just by having these conversations and being transparent and, filling in the gaps. That's really all I want to do. And I think we talked about that. I mean, there's just so many gaps that exist.
Yeah. The last thing I'd like to mention is if anybody would like, to get into the space of creating a site, or maybe they're a clinician and want to get in the space, I had shared with Brad a deck of, kind of our standard toolkit, SOPs and stuff. And so, I want to make that readily available to anybody that wants to enter that space. They can contact me through the support at Clinicom. And I'm happy to share that entire start a site toolkit up with anybody that wants to learn more.
Yeah, no, that was super awesome and generous. I'll make sure I'll link that in the show notes too. And yeah, I think you should come back on here in a few weeks, do a live, and we can elaborate on some more of these things and kind of go from there. And like I said, I'll put all your contact info and Clinicom's as well in the show notes, man. But I appreciate you coming on.
Appreciate you. Hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
As always, thank you so much for listening to Note to File Podcast. Make sure and check out notetofilepodcast.com for our previous 86 episodes, and check out our weekly live stream Tuesdays at noon Eastern. Thanks, guys.